Hey everyone! Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell because today's story is one you won't forget. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where the queen rises and justice is hers to command. Today I'm sharing a story about betrayal, resilience, and the kind of revenge that starts quietly but shakes the very foundations of those who dared to underestimate me. It all began in the summer when the heat in the air felt heavier than usual, as if it carried secrets that had been simmering for years. I had always thought I was close to my family. I had grown up believing that blood meant loyalty, that the people who brought me into this world would naturally stand by me when life got rough. I had been taught that family was everything, that we protected each other, that we supported one another through thick and thin. But life has a way of revealing truths in the cruelest of ways, and I was about to learn one that would forever change the way I viewed love, loyalty, and obligation. It started with the death of my father, a man who had been both distant and imposing in his later years, yet still a central figure in the image of my life. His passing was not unexpected. His health had been declining for some time. But what I didn't anticipate was the cold, calculated way the family gathered after his death, exchanging glances, polite smiles, and whispered strategies about the inheritance. The tension in the air was palpable, and I, foolishly perhaps, assumed my presence alone would secure my place in the family's future. When the lawyer finally handed us the will, I remember feeling a surge of pride. I had always supported my family in tangible ways, financially, emotionally, and even socially. I had sacrificed vacations, personal luxuries, and even opportunities of my own so that my siblings could live comfortably, my parents could maintain appearances, and our family could uphold the facade of unity. I had assumed that loyalty would be recognized, that devotion would be rewarded. I could not have been more wrong. As the lawyer began to read the document, the room's energy shifted. My mother clutched her pearls as if they were shields, my siblings smirked with subtle triumph, and I listened with growing unease as the words became more and more alien. My heart sank, my pulse quickened, and a cold dread began to creep into my chest. The will was meticulously structured, outlining each inheritance with precision, each asset distributed in careful detail. Every asset, that is, except to me. My name was absent. Every account, every property, every investment was allocated to my siblings, with not even a mention for the child who had sacrificed so much. It was as if I had been erased from the very history I had helped build. For a moment I felt frozen, the room spinning slowly around me. How could this be? How could my own family, the people I had supported through crises, heartbreak, and financial struggles, leave me out entirely? The lawyer continued, unaware of the storm brewing inside me, unaware that every word he spoke was chiseling away at the last remnants of trust one had in those I had called family. When the reading concluded, I excused myself, retreating to the quiet of my childhood room. The walls, once a sanctuary of memories, now felt suffocating, pressing in on me with the weight of betrayal. Sitting alone, I replayed every moment, every sacrifice, every gesture of loyalty, asking myself where it had all gone wrong. I remembered the countless nights I had stayed awake, working multiple jobs, covering bills, sending money, helping with emergencies, while my siblings enjoyed a life cushioned by my support. I remembered the arguments I had silently absorbed, the dismissive comments, the subtle attempts to undermine me, all of it painted in a new light now that I knew the truth. I had been a silent supporter, a shadow, and in the end, that made me invisible in the eyes of those I loved. Anger surged, but it was not a reckless, loud anger. It was a calculated, smoldering fire, the kind that fuels strategy, focus, and decisive action. I realized that my energy, my time, and my resources had been spent enriching others while leaving myself vulnerable. The revelation that I had been excluded was not just a financial blow. It was an existential one. I had given everything to people who never intended to honor me in return. That knowledge alone was power because it clarified my next steps. I began to analyze my situation with precision. I listed every asset, every relationship, every opportunity one had leveraged to support them. I recalled the business investments I had financed, the social contacts I had nurtured, the personal growth I had postponed. And slowly, deliberately, I began to see the path forward. I would cut the support I had so willingly given. I would stop being the invisible enabler, the silent provider, the one who was always there. Instead, I would rise, not in anger but in calculated assertion of my worth. The moment of betrayal became the moment of empowerment. Days turned into weeks as I withdrew. I stopped lending money, I refused requests for assistance, and I began to redirect my attention entirely toward myself. I invested in my own dreams, prioritized my ambitions, and focused on creating opportunities that were entirely my own. The initial guilt was sharp like a sting to the chest, but it faded as the clarity of purpose took root. I was not being cruel. I was reclaiming the energy and resources that had been quietly drained from me for years. This was not vengeance. This was survival, and it was reclamation of my identity. The family noticed, of course. Subtle inquiries turned into overt questions, polite requests became pointed demands, and their smirks began to falter as I consistently refused to be the financial lifeline they had relied on. For the first time, I saw the fear behind their carefully maintained composure. The realization that I was no longer under their control, that my loyalty was no longer a commodity to be exploited. It was a small victory, but it fueled me. And yet, I knew that financial independence alone would not suffice. Emotional and social leverage was equally crucial. I began networking strategically, forming alliances with people who respected and valued me, cultivating influence in circles where my absence had previously left a void. Slowly, I became a force to be reckoned with. A queen in her own right, commanding attention, respect, and power without relying on the validation of those who had once betrayed me. But the real turning point came when I realized that the world outside my family did not owe me anything either. Every opportunity one pursued, every deal I closed, every connection I nurtured, became proof not just of my resilience, but of my indispensability. I was no longer dependent on the family that had written me out of their future. In that truth lay a freedom so profound it was intoxicating. I could breathe again, plan again, and most importantly, I could rise again. As I sat in the quiet of my own space, reflecting on the chain of events that had led me here, I understood that this was only the beginning. The anger that had sparked within me was no longer destructive. It was transformative. I was preparing to take the next steps, not in haste but with precision. I would reclaim what was mine, not merely in financial terms, but in dignity, respect, and recognition. The betrayal had been cruel, the lesson harsh, but I had emerged with clarity. I was no longer the family's invisible supporter. I was the architect of my own destiny, a queen whose power had been underestimated, whose strength had been ignored, and whose resolve could not be broken. The first weeks after my realization were a mixture of clarity and subtle chaos. Cutting off support to the family wasn't just a financial decision. It was a psychological statement, and I approached it with careful calculation. I knew that a sudden overt withdrawal could provoke panic or worse, lead them to attempt manipulation. Instead, I chose a measured, almost invisible approach. Every action was deliberate, every step intended to assert my independence while quietly testing how much they relied on me. I started with the smaller, more inconspicuous ways. I stopped sending money to cover their utility bills. I ceased financing the monthly credit card payments I had been handling for my siblings, and I quietly redirected the savings to investments in myself. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but the absence of my usual support began to ripple through the household. I could sense the uncertainty building like a storm-gathering force behind closed doors. The first reaction came from my eldest sibling. They approached me under the guise of casual conversation, trying to gauge my intentions, probing for weaknesses, for an opportunity to reinstate the status quo. But I remained calm, composed, polite, even giving nothing away. They left frustrated, and I felt a surge of satisfaction. Their confidence in my loyalty had been unshakable, but now it was cracking, and I was quietly enjoying the subtle tremor of unease I had instilled. Meanwhile, I focused on consolidating my own life. Every moment I had previously spent solving their problems was now redirected to building my career, nurturing my personal brand, and expanding my network. I invested in courses that sharpened my skills, joined professional circles that elevated my influence, and sought opportunities that had been postponed for years because I had been too busy being the safety net for others. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family who had dismissed my contributions would now, unknowingly, be witnessing my ascent. As I strengthened my independence, the family's attempts to reclaim my attention intensified. Requests became demands, and guilt trips were deployed as weapons. They tried to evoke nostalgia, reminding me of the sacrifices I had made for them, the time I had given, the energy I had spent supporting their dreams. But I had anticipated this. I had built a mental fortress around myself, one that could withstand manipulation, one that recognized the difference between loyalty and exploitation. Their words were powerless against a mind that had resolved to rise. The social dimension of my withdrawal proved to be just as powerful as the financial. Friends and acquaintances who had known me primarily through family ties began noticing my absence. I made strategic appearances in professional settings, always composed, always confident, subtly signaling that my world no longer revolved around their needs. Word began to spread quietly, through social channels, mutual contacts, and professional circles, that I was building something new, something formidable, independent of the family that had dismissed me. The ripple effect was immediate, and I relished the knowledge that my invisibility was transforming into influence. The family, of course, did not respond with grace. The first confrontation came in the form of a direct, sharp message from my mother, laced with hurt and anger, claiming that I was abandoning them. But I refused to justify myself. I knew that any explanation would be twisted, any defense turned into a weapon. Instead, I simply remained distant, letting silence speak volumes. The power of absence is underestimated, and I wielded it like a weapon. Every ignored call, every unanswered question, every refusal to intervene slowly shifted the dynamics. It was during this time that I began documenting everything. Every instance of reliance, every financial handout, every emotional manipulation. The more I recorded, the more I understood the pattern. My support had been treated as entitlement, my generosity as an obligation rather than a gift. This documentation wasn't just for strategy. It was for clarity, a reminder of why I had chosen this path, a record of the asymmetry between effort given and recognition received. It fueled my resolve, and it prepared me for the next stages of my plan. Unexpectedly, I also discovered allies outside my immediate circle. Former colleagues, distant relatives, and acquaintances who had witnessed my quiet generosity over the years began reaching out, offering opportunities, connections, and mentorship. These were people who valued me for my talent, my intelligence, and my vision, not because I was a convenient financial resource. Their support was empowering, validating, and transformative. It reinforced the lesson I had learned painfully. True recognition comes from merit, not obligation, and loyalty should be reciprocal, not coerced. Meanwhile, tension in the family grew palpable. I could sense it in subtle shifts, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the quick glances, the undercurrent of frustration that laced their interactions. They began to realize that I was no longer the easy answer to their problems. The roles had shifted. I was no longer the supporting actor in their story. I had become the independent force they could no longer control, the silent queen who had reclaimed her agency. As weeks passed, I moved beyond simple withdrawal. I began redirecting financial resources to ventures that benefited me directly. Investments that had once been hypothetical were now active, growing, and multiplying. I started consulting on projects that increased my professional visibility. I sought high-value collaborations that elevated my profile and positioned me as a power player in spaces where influence mattered. The energy I had spent sustaining others was now a catalyst for my own empire. And yet, the most satisfying aspect of this transformation wasn't the financial gains or social leverage. It was the psychological awakening. Every attempt they made to draw me back into dependency was met with composure, clarity, and strategic restraint. I was no longer reactive. I was proactive, guiding my destiny instead of being guided by the expectations of those who had abandoned me in their inheritance. This mastery of self, this assertion of independence, became intoxicating. It was not vengeance. It was empowerment, a declaration that I would no longer be invisible. By the end of the second month, the change was undeniable. The family, once confident in my availability, was faltering. My absence had created a vacuum that no one else could fill. Their whispers of frustration became more pointed, their attempts at control more desperate. And all the while, I continued to expand my reach, my influence, and my independence, building a life that no longer depended on their acknowledgement. I had cut the cords that had tethered me to them, and in doing so, I had discovered the liberation that comes from being truly self-reliant. But even as I celebrated these victories, I knew the most pivotal moments were yet to come. Withdrawal alone was not enough. To truly assert my power, to ensure that my contributions were recognized and my boundaries respected, I would need to step into arenas they had underestimated me in. I would need to transform absence into influence, frustration into opportunity, and betrayal into a platform for undeniable authority. The world outside my family's expectations had begun to reveal itself in ways I had never imagined. The withdrawal of my support, while subtle, had created a ripple I could now ride, and every action I took was calculated to maximize my independence while quietly asserting power. But it wasn't enough to simply stop giving. They needed to see that my absence was not weakness but strength. It was time to transform invisibility into undeniable influence, and I embraced the challenge with a focus that left no room for hesitation. The first step was visibility. I began attending events, conferences, and professional gatherings where I had previously been a silent participant. I invested in myself in ways that my family had always assumed were optional. Leadership programs, specialized courses, and high-profile mentorships. The more I immersed myself, the more I realized how undervalued my contributions had been, not just within my family but in the larger sphere of influence. Suddenly, doors that had been closed for years began to open, and I stepped through each one with confidence, grace, and an acute awareness of my newfound leverage. Financial independence became tangible. Investments I had quietly nurtured during my withdrawal began yielding returns, and my ventures expanded faster than anticipated. Every gain was a reminder of the power I had reclaimed, and every successful move strengthened the narrative I was building. I did not need them, yet I had the ability to surpass them in ways they could never anticipate. It was subtle at first. A strategic post here, a collaborative project there, but the trajectory was unmistakable. The Queen had begun her ascent, quietly but irrevocably. Meanwhile, the family's reactions intensified. They were now aware that I was no longer dependent, no longer pliable, no longer the silent provider who could be counted on at a moment's notice. Their frustrations leaked into every interaction, visible in the sharp glances, the whispered conversations, and the veiled accusations. They began attempting to undermine me, questioning my choices, trying to sow doubt, yet each attempt only reinforced my resolve. I had anticipated resistance, and I remained unshakable, using their hostility as a guide for how far I had already moved beyond their influence. The next phase of my strategy was subtle social influence. I began cultivating alliances that elevated my status while exposing the family's reliance on my past support. Friends, colleagues, and professional contacts, some who had long admired my discretion and generosity, started recognizing the force I had become. Invitations to exclusive events, opportunities to lead initiatives, and positions of authority began presenting themselves. I navigated each situation with precision, always mindful that the visibility I cultivated would carry lessons back to those who had excluded me. Influence, I realized, was a currency far more potent than mere money, and I wielded it expertly. Public recognition was transformative. When my first significant venture succeeded, it became a quiet shockwave. The family, who had once depended on my resources and advice, could not ignore the attention I was receiving. Social media posts, professional acknowledgments, and word-of-mouth accolades began to paint a picture they had never imagined. I had thrived without them. They could see the evidence of my success, but their pride and ego prevented them from acknowledging it openly. And that silence, that unspoken frustration, was the sweetest affirmation of all. Financial independence alone, however, was never my goal. The real victory was psychological, the reclamation of control and respect. I had transformed their assumptions about me into assumptions about their own vulnerability. Every step I took was deliberate, calculated to reveal not just my success, but the cost of their betrayal. Every project I completed, every recognition I received was a statement. They had underestimated me, and that underestimation would be their loss. Strategically, I also began reassessing long-standing personal relationships. Those who had used me as a crutch, expecting my support without reciprocation, were gradually removed from my inner circle. It was not vengeance, it was self-preservation. The Queen surrounds herself with allies, not dependents, with respect, not entitlement. Every relationship that remained was one of mutual benefit, trust, and empowerment. The isolation that had once felt like punishment had become a tool, a filter revealing who valued me for my worth and who valued me for my resources. The family's discomfort grew with each passing week. They began to notice the tangible consequences of my absence. Projects they had once relied on me to support faltered. Emergencies I had managed silently spiraled into crises. Subtle manipulations that had previously worked now failed, because I had withdrawn not out of anger but out of purpose. I was untouchable, not because I was inaccessible but because I had positioned myself where they could no longer dictate my terms. Power, I discovered, was not just about resources. It was about autonomy, visibility, and control over narrative. And yet, even as I built momentum, I remained patient. I observed, I calculated, and I waited for the right moments to assert influence where it would matter most. I knew that premature exposure of my capabilities could provoke resistance too early, before my position was secure. Timing, as the Queen knows, is everything. Each small victory, the attention I garnered, the recognition I received, the alliances I formed, was a step toward a larger, undeniable statement. I had been wronged, but I had risen, and my ascent could no longer be ignored. By mid-year, the changes were visible not just to me but to the world and to my family. Invitations, accolades, and opportunities reinforced my independence, while their reliance on my absence became increasingly evident. The quiet confidence I exuded served as a mirror to them, reflecting their own dependence and their own misjudgment. Their frustration, thinly veiled as polite concern or curiosity, became fuel for my continued ascent. The more they attempted to undermine, the more I consolidated power, transforming every act of manipulation into proof of my resilience and foresight. The psychological transformation within me was profound. I no longer measured my worth through the lens of familial approval. Recognition, influence, and power were now mine to cultivate on my own terms. I understood with crystal clarity that the betrayal I had suffered was a catalyst, not a chain. It had exposed weakness in their character, yes, but it had also revealed strength within me. And I intended to use that strength not only to rise but to assert my presence where it could no longer be denied. By the end of the third quarter, the foundation of my empire was set. My family had been forced to confront the consequences of their choices, not through confrontation but through observation. They watched as I navigated social, financial, and professional spaces with autonomy and precision. They saw the tangible results of my independence, the respect I commanded, and the alliances I had formed. And in that quiet observation lay the first seeds of reckoning, a reckoning that would only grow as I continued my ascent. My absence had already unsettled the family, my quiet successes had begun to attract attention, and yet I knew the real power lay not in distance or passive observation. It lay in deliberate, strategic action. I was no longer content with merely thriving while they floundered. It was time for them to fully comprehend the consequences of leaving me out of the will. I needed the recognition, the acknowledgement, and the undeniable proof that underestimating me had been their gravest mistake. The first step was confrontation, though not in the traditional sense. I did not raise my voice, nor did I storm into rooms demanding attention. Instead, I allowed the results of my efforts to speak for themselves. I strategically shared accomplishments, subtly and indirectly, ensuring that they could not ignore them. Professional accolades, successful ventures, and expanding influence were all showcased in ways that were visible yet controlled. The family's initial reaction was confusion, followed by quiet panic. They began asking questions, probing into the projects I had completed, trying to grasp the scope of what they had once dismissed. But I offered no explanations. Their curiosity was met with poise, their concern with composure. Every attempt to pry only reinforced their realization. I had moved beyond their control. Simultaneously, I began to leverage influence in spaces where my family had always assumed I was powerless. I collaborated with individuals in positions of authority, built alliances with influential networks, and cultivated opportunities that elevated my presence publicly. Invitations to speak, lead, or participate in high-profile projects started coming my way, and I accepted selectively, ensuring that each move reinforced the narrative I was crafting. I was not just independent, I was indispensable. And they, the family who had once counted on me, were forced to witness it all without the ability to intervene. The shift in dynamics was palpable. At family gatherings, the air grew tense. They attempted casual questions, veiled critiques, and subtle digs, but each encounter only showcased my growth. I listened more than I spoke, smiled politely, and allowed silence to emphasize the power I now wielded. Every glance I received, every whispered conversation I overheard, confirmed that my presence alone had become a statement. I was no longer invisible. I was the queen, and the court that had ignored me was beginning to realize it. Financial leverage, which had been my initial weapon, now became a secondary tool of assertion. I maintained strict boundaries regarding any requests for support, while quietly using my resources to build ventures that directly impacted my public image. Investments grew, influence expanded, and recognition multiplied. But the most satisfying victories were the ones they could not anticipate. The subtle ways in which their dependence on me in the past now became a measure of their own vulnerability. The very family that had written me out of inheritance was now indirectly reliant on the absence I had engineered. Every missed payment, every failed endeavor, every stalled opportunity was a quiet testament to the power I had reclaimed. I also began to establish a broader narrative externally, one that positioned me not merely as a survivor, but as a force to be reckoned with. Public recognition, social influence, and professional respect became intertwined with my personal story. Through carefully curated achievements and visible accomplishments, I communicated a message without uttering a single word. I had been wronged, but I had risen. They watched, helpless, as the image of my empowerment became undeniable. The silence of their envy and disbelief was the most potent validation I could have hoped for. And yet I remained patient. True power, I had learned, was never reactive. It was deliberate, calculated, and anticipatory. I continued to expand, building not just wealth or influence but credibility and authority. Every move was strategic. Alliances were chosen carefully, projects were selected for maximum impact, and opportunities were pursued with precision. I was crafting a legacy not just for myself, but as a lesson in the consequences of betrayal. Those who had underestimated me were beginning to grasp, in their own subtle ways, that the queen they thought they had dismissed was now untouchable. The family's desperation became increasingly visible. Attempts at manipulation escalated. Casual comments turned into pointed criticisms, subtle accusations evolved into overt challenges, and polite inquiries became insistent demands for attention and support. But I was prepared. I met each maneuver with composure, turning their aggression into a reflection of their own inadequacies. I no longer feared confrontation. I had grown stronger through absence, resilient through isolation, and empowered through strategic action. The Queen's rise was not a reaction, it was inevitability. The psychological impact on them was profound. They had assumed loyalty was guaranteed, that support was a constant, and that my presence was a given. The withdrawal, combined with the visibility of my achievements, challenged every assumption they had ever held. Frustration, envy, and subtle panic replaced their confidence. The more they tried to understand or control me, the more evident it became that I was operating in a sphere they could not touch. Their disbelief was mirrored in every interaction, every glance, every unspoken acknowledgement of my power. In parallel, I cultivated a circle of allies who amplified my influence. Friends, colleagues, and mentors who recognized my value became not only supporters but advocates. These relationships extended my reach, reinforced my credibility, and amplified the narrative I was creating. I realized that influence is rarely confined to money alone. It is social, professional, and psychological. I leveraged all three, creating an ecosystem where my independence was not only visible but influential, and where the consequences of past betrayal were unavoidable in their perception. By the end of this phase, the Queen had truly risen. Absence had become power, withdrawal had become strategy, and independence had become influence. The family, once secure in their assumptions, was now forced to confront a reality they had long ignored. Underestimating me had been a monumental mistake. Every success, every recognition, every strategic alliance reinforced the truth that they could not contain or control me. I was no longer merely surviving. I was thriving, asserting, and commanding the space I had always been owed. The stage was set. Every move I had made over the past months, the withdrawal of support, the cultivation of influence, the strategic alliances, and the careful elevation of my public presence, was leading to this moment. I had transformed absence into power, betrayal into opportunity, and underestimation into undeniable authority. The family, who had once taken me for granted, were about to face the reality of what it meant to dismiss a queen. By now, their dependence on my past contributions had become painfully clear, not through confrontation but through observation. Projects that relied on the organizational skills I had silently provided for years began to falter. Opportunities they had assumed would succeed with my backing stalled or failed. Every misstep, every crisis that I had once quietly resolved became a visible reflection of my absence. They were forced to reckon with the truth. The infrastructure they had relied upon, the foundation I had provided, had been mine, not theirs. And without it, they were vulnerable. I had also positioned myself in spheres they could not touch. Professional recognition, public acknowledgement, and strategic influence had created a platform where my authority was unassailable. Invitations to lead initiatives, speak at high-profile events, and collaborate with powerful networks were no longer opportunities. They were affirmations of my status. Each accolade, each success, was a subtle declaration. I had risen and I was unstoppable. The family could watch, criticize, or attempt to intervene, but they could no longer control the narrative. I owned it. Their attempts to engage me grew increasingly desperate. Messages, calls, and visits became more insistent, but I met each with calm detachment. Polite refusals, strategic silence, and measured responses communicated far more than words could. I had learned that presence alone was power, and absence, deliberate and controlled, was even more potent. Every attempt to manipulate or guilt me only highlighted their reliance on what they had once ignored. The Queen's authority, after all, is never demanded, it is recognized. I also began to assert myself directly, though subtly. I made strategic appearances at family events, not to plead or explain, but to showcase the success and independence they had overlooked. My demeanor, confidence, and accomplishments spoke volumes. The acknowledgement I received from others, the respect, admiration, and recognition, amplified the impact, serving as a mirror to the family of what they had missed. They could no longer dismiss me. They could no longer assume control. They were witnessing firsthand the Queen they had ignored. Financial independence, while no longer my primary weapon, reinforced the narrative. Investments had grown, ventures had flourished, and opportunities one had cultivated were multiplying. The contrast between their reliance on my absence and my thriving presence elsewhere was stark. Every success became a testament to resilience, intelligence, and foresight. They had assumed that exclusion from the will equaled exclusion from power, and yet I had demonstrated the opposite. Power, as I had learned, was not granted. It was seized, nurtured, and asserted. The psychological impact on them was profound. They were forced to confront not just my success but their own misjudgment. Envy, regret, and subtle panic replaced their confidence. The Queen had risen beyond their influence, and they could neither control nor diminish her achievements. They had attempted to dictate my worth, to assign value to my contributions, and to marginalize my presence. Now they had no choice but to acknowledge that the Queen they underestimated was the one orchestrating her own destiny, and that her rise could not be reversed. But the ultimate assertion of authority was more than financial or professional success. It was the reclamation of dignity and self-respect. I no longer measured my worth through the lens of familial validation. Every decision I made, every opportunity one seized, every achievement I celebrated was a declaration that I belonged not to them but to myself. Independence had become a weapon, resilience a shield, and recognition a crown. I had transformed betrayal into empowerment, and the consequences were visible not only to the family, but to everyone who had once underestimated me. The final pieces of my strategy involved demonstrating the consequences of their choices in subtle but undeniable ways. I ensured that projects they had relied on me to support were completed independently by others, highlighting both my competence and their dependence. I celebrated achievements publicly, allowing recognition to filter naturally, leaving no doubt about the disparity between what I had provided and what they had assumed. Every success became both a victory and a lesson. Underestimate the Queen at your own peril. By the end of this journey, the family had been forced to confront the truth of their choices. Exclusion from the will had not diminished me, it had catalyzed my rise. Their reliance on my contributions, their misjudgment of my capabilities, and their failure to acknowledge my worth had all been laid bare. And as they watched, helpless and frustrated, I understood the ultimate lesson. True power cannot be given, it cannot be granted, and it cannot be ignored. It is seized, cultivated, and recognized, and I had done all three with precision, grace, and unwavering determination. In the quiet aftermath, I reflected on the journey. Betrayal had been the spark, absence had been the tool, and strategic empowerment had been the path. I had transformed the pain of exclusion into the fuel for ascension, demonstrating that a queen cannot be contained, underestimated, or erased. The family, once confident in their assumptions, had been forced to reckon with reality, and the queen who had been left out of the will now stood fully in her power. And so, as this story closes, the lesson is clear. Betrayal is not the end. It is the beginning of transformation. Independence is not merely a shield. It is a platform for power. And recognition is not demanded. It is earned, nurtured, and ultimately undeniable. I had been left out of the will, cut from the family's plan, and underestimated at every turn. But in doing so, I had reclaimed what was always mine: my strength, my dignity, and my unassailable place as the queen of my own destiny. This is the end of the journey. The queen has risen, the lesson has been delivered, and the legacy has been secured. Those who doubted, dismissed, and betrayed me now bear witness to the truth. The Black Queen cannot be ignored.